In December 1970, a brand new drum kit arrived at a crumbling former poorhouse in rural Hampshire, England. Nobody ordered it to be placed in the recording room where Led Zeppelin were working. Nobody asked for it to go anywhere specific. The delivery crew, looking for somewhere to put it while the band were busy, carried it into the main hallway of the building and left it there at the bottom of a 3-story stone staircase. That decision, made by anonymous delivery men who had no idea what they were doing, produced what engineers and drummers have spent 50 years trying to recreate and failing. The building was called Headley Grange. The drummer was John Bonham. The sound that came out of that stairwell when Bonham sat down and started playing is the opening of a song called When the Levee Breaks. And if you have ever heard it through a good pair of headphones or a serious speaker system, you already know that what you heard was not a recording of drums in a room. It was something else entirely. Something that sounded like the ground moving. Something that sounded like weather. If you're new here, this channel tells the real stories behind Led Zeppelin that nobody talked about. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. This is the story of how it happened, why it has never been recreated, and what it tells us about the intersection of accident, genius, and a specific stone staircase in Hampshire that no longer exists in the same form it did on the night John Bonham first played in it. To understand what happened at Headley Grange in December 1970, you need to understand what Headley Grange was and why Led Zeppelin were there at all. Headley Grange was not a recording studio. It was a building with a long and unglamorous history that had nothing to do with music. It had been built in the 1790s as a workhouse, which, in the English context of that period, meant a place where people without money or employment were housed, in exchange for compulsory labor under conditions that were designed to be as unpleasant as possible, on the theory that only genuine desperation should drive anyone to seek public assistance. It was a harsh, utilitarian building, constructed for a purpose that had nothing to do with comfort or aesthetics, with stone floors, high ceilings, large, austere rooms, and the kind of thick walls that absorbed sound in some places and amplified it in others in ways that no acoustic engineer had planned for. By the late 19th century, the workhouse had been converted into a private residence, and by the time Led Zeppelin found it in 1970, it was a somewhat dilapidated country house available for rent by bands who wanted to get out of London and work without the clock running at an expensive commercial studio. Bad Company would record there. Fleetwood Mac would record there. Genesis would record there. Peter Frampton would record there. The building had the quality that some old structures have, which is that its imperfections had accumulated into a kind of character that purpose-built environments could not manufacture. The rooms were cold and damp in winter. The plumbing was unreliable. The acoustics were entirely unpredictable. And none of that mattered, because what it offered was space, isolation, and the ability to work at any hour without worrying about studio bookings or neighbors. Led Zeppelin had already used Headley Grange for Led Zeppelin IV, recorded the previous year. They had moved into the building, lived there while they worked, written and recorded simultaneously, and found that the environment produced something different in them than a conventional studio did. Jimmy Page had a specific philosophy about recording drums that ran directly against the standard practice of his era. The standard practice was close miking, which meant placing microphones as near to each drum as possible to capture a clean, isolated signal that could then be processed in the mix. Page believed this was wrong. He believed that drums needed to breathe, which was his way of saying that the space around a drum kit, the air it displaced, the surfaces the sound bounced off, The time it took for the sound to travel and return were as much a part of the drum sound as the instrument itself. Nobody else was doing this in any systematic way in 1970. Page was insistent about it. So when Led Zeppelin arrived at Headley Grange in December 1970 to record what would become their fourth album, the most commercially successful and critically celebrated record of their career, they brought with them not just their instruments, but the Rolling Stones mobile studio, a fully equipped recording facility built into a truck that could be parked outside any building and connected by cable to microphones and instruments inside. The truck had been built for the Stones and was available for hire by other bands. Led Zeppelin used it because it meant they could record wherever they were, rather than being constrained by the location of a fixed studio. Andy Johns was the recording engineer. He was 22 years old, the younger brother of Glyn Johns, who had engineered Led Zeppelin's debut album, and he had been working with the band since the third album. He was, by multiple accounts, someone whose ears worked differently from most people's, who heard acoustic spaces the way other people heard melodies, who walked into a room and immediately began calculating what it would do to sound. He would later describe his approach to engineering in terms that made it sound like a physical instinct rather than a technical skill. The only lessons you really got, he said, were making the musicians happy. He made the musicians happy by finding sounds they had not imagined. The song that became When the Levee Breaks had a history before Led Zeppelin got to it. It had been written and recorded in 1929 by Kansas Joe McCoy and Memphis Minnie, a blues duo whose original version documented the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. A flood that had displaced hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed everything built in its path across 26,000 square miles of the Mississippi Delta. Memphis Minnie had been living near Walls, Mississippi when the levee broke. She wrote what she had seen. Robert Plant had the original McCoy and Minnie recording in his personal collection and had been thinking about what Led Zeppelin might do with it. Jimmy Page had been working independently on a guitar riff that had a particular quality of weight and inevitability to it, a riff that moved slowly and heavily in a way that suggested something enormous gathering force. The two ideas had not yet found each other when the band arrived at Headley Grange, but they both existed, and it was clear to everyone working on the fourth album that whatever they built from those materials needed a drum foundation that could carry the weight of the original song's subject matter. They had already tried recording When the Levee Breaks at Island Studios in London at the beginning of the album sessions. It had not worked. The sound they got at Island was competent and professional and entirely wrong. It did not feel like a flood. It did not feel like the ground giving way under something too heavy to stop. It felt like a rock band in a studio, which was what it was. And that was precisely the problem. They set the song aside and moved on to other material, knowing they would come back to it, but not yet knowing what it needed. What it needed arrived at Headley Grange inside a delivery truck in December 1970. John Bonham had ordered a new drum kit. It was a Ludwig kit, brand new from the factory, and it arrived at Headley Grange while the band were in the middle of another session. The delivery crew, following the logic of people who need to put something down somewhere, carried the new kit into the main hallway of the building because that was where there was space. They set it up at the bottom of the 3-story staircase and left it. There are two versions of what happened next, and both are documented, and the discrepancy between them is itself revealing. Jimmy Page, recalling the moment in the documentary It Might Get Loud, said that it was Bonham's roadie who set up the kit in the hallway, and that when Bonham came out and started playing it in the stairwell, Page heard the sound coming through the building and immediately understood that something was happening that needed to be captured. He described the reverberation in the hallway, the huge expanse of it, the sound reflecting off the walls, the wonderful ambience. He said he went to find Andy Johns. Andy Johns told a different story. He said that one evening the rest of the band had gone to the pub, and he had asked Bonham to stay behind because he had an idea. He had been walking through the hallway and had noticed what the stone staircase did to ordinary sound, the way it gathered and amplified and returned it with a weight that had nothing to do with the original volume. He sent the band away, kept Bonham back, and told him to sit down at the kit and start playing. Then he ran cables up 2 floors to the second-floor landing, suspended 2 biodynamic M160 ribbon microphones in a stereo configuration pointing downward, and ran to the mobile recording truck outside to listen to what the microphones were picking up. What he heard made him understand immediately that something extraordinary was possible. He called Bonham in from the hallway. "Come and listen to this, dear chap," was his reported phrasing, which was formal enough to suggest he was working very hard to remain calm. Bonham came in, listened, and said, in terms rather less formal than Johns had used, "Oh yeah, that's more fucking like it." Whether the discovery was Page's or Johns's, whether it was a spontaneous accident or a planned experiment, is a question that the 2 men answered differently across decades of interviews. What both accounts agree on is the central fact. The sound that came out of that staircase when Bonham played his new Ludwig kit was unlike anything that had been recorded before, and everyone who heard it understood immediately that they were not going to use anything else. The technical reality of what was happening in that stairwell was straightforward to describe and impossible to replicate exactly. The stone structure of Headley Grange's 3-story entrance hall created a natural reverb chamber of specific dimensions that no recording studio had been built to reproduce. Sound entering the stairwell from below traveled upward, bounced off the stone walls at angles determined by the precise geometry of the space, reflected off the ceiling and the landing above, and returned to the microphones carrying the character of every surface it had touched. The time it took for the sound to travel from the drum to the microphone and back was not the result of any electronic effect. It was physics operating in a specific stone building that had been standing since the 1790s. The 2 biodynamic M160 ribbon microphones that Johns suspended from the second-floor landing were pointing down at a kit they could not see. They were capturing not the drums directly, but the room's response to the drums, which is an entirely different thing. When the kick drum hit, the microphones heard it not as a sharp transient, but as something that had traveled upward through 20 feet of stone-walled space and arrived at them, already shaped and weighted by the journey. When the snare hit, the same thing happened. The result was a sound that had already been processed by architecture before any electronic signal processing was applied. Back in the Rolling Stones' mobile studio parked outside, Johns ran the signal from those 2 microphones through a pair of Helios F760 compressor limiters set aggressively, which created what engineers call a breathing effect, a pulsing quality in the reverb tail where the compression responds to the dynamic of the drums and the room simultaneously. Then, he ran the compressed signal through Jimmy Page's Binson EchoRec, an Italian-made echo unit that added a further layer of ambience and a slight slapback quality that reinforced the natural reverb of the staircase rather than competing with it. The kick drum was never individually mic'd. No close mics were used on any part of the kit. Everything heard on the final recording came from those 2 microphones on the second-floor landing. There is a detail in the recording that is rarely discussed, but that reveals how far Johns and Page were willing to push the processing. Parts of the song were recorded at a different tempo from the final version and then slowed down, which created the sludgy quality that most listeners perceive as simply a heavy groove, but which is actually a deliberate manipulation of time. The harmonica, which appears in the song with a haunting, backward-falling quality, was processed with a reverse echo effect that makes the echo appear before the source sound rather than after it. The guitar solos were similarly time-altered. What sounds like a live performance captured in a hallway is in fact a construction of multiple technical decisions layered on top of the acoustic foundation that the staircase provided. None of this diminishes what Bonham did. Andy Johns said it himself, directly and without qualification, when asked whether the staircase sound could be reproduced without Bonham. Good luck getting that sound again, because you really do need Bonzo. The staircase and the microphones and the compressors and the echo unit were necessary, but not sufficient. What made the drum sound on When the Levee Breaks was the interaction between a specific room and a specific man playing with a specific combination of power and restraint that no other drummer of his era possessed in the same combination. Bonham hit hard. This is not a complicated observation. He hit harder than other drummers consistently, not occasionally. Dave Grohl, Roger Taylor, Neil Peart, every serious drummer who has discussed Bonham at length eventually arrives at the same point. The physical force Bonham applied to a drum kit was categorically different from what other people applied. And that difference was not about aggression or carelessness, but about the efficiency and precision with which he transferred energy from his limbs to the instrument. He was not hitting randomly hard. He was hitting precisely hard, which is an entirely different skill. The particular groove he played on When the Levee Breaks is slow, around 72 beats per minute, which is slower than most rock music and which places demands on the drummer that fast tempos do not. At slow tempos, every element of timing is exposed. There is nowhere to hide an imprecise hit, no momentum carrying the groove forward that can cover for a fraction of a second's inaccuracy. The relationship between the kick drum, the snare, and the open hi-hat on When the Levee Breaks is built on a hesitation, a deliberate slight delay in the snare placement that gives the groove its push-pull quality, its sense of something enormous moving forward with controlled inevitability. This is not written in any score. It is feel, the product of a musician who had internalized the idiom of blues, drumming so completely that the hesitation was not a choice he made consciously. It was simply what his body did when he played that tempo. In the staircase at Headley Grange, that groove entered the stone space, and the stone space gave it back, transformed. The hesitation in the snare became, by the time it reached the microphones 20 feet above, something that felt like a pause before an impact. The kick drum arrived at the microphones, carrying the weight of the room. The open hi-hat scattered across the walls and came back as shimmer. What Bonham played was powerful. What the staircase returned was seismic. When the Levee Breaks was released on November 8, 1971, as the final track on Led Zeppelin IV. The album had no title, no band name, no information of any kind on its cover. It contained Stairway to Heaven, Black Dog, and Rock and Roll. It became one of the best-selling albums in the history of recorded music. And despite all of that, the song that ended the album, the last thing you heard before the needle lifted, was the one that engineers and producers kept returning to when they wanted to understand what was possible. The drum break at the opening of When the Levee Breaks became one of the most sampled pieces of music ever recorded. The Beastie Boys used it on Ryman and Steelin on Licensed to Ill, which was so direct a use that the remaining members of Led Zeppelin took legal action. Eminem used it. Dr. Dre used it. Björk used it. Depeche Mode used it. Massive Attack used it. Mike Oldfield used it. Beyoncé used it on Don't Hurt Yourself. The list extends across every genre and every decade since 1971. When producers wanted drums that sounded enormous, they went to the opening bars of When the Levee Breaks, rather than trying to record something comparable themselves, because recording something comparable was not practically achievable. Led Zeppelin themselves found the song nearly impossible to play live. The drum sound that defined the recording could not be reproduced on a concert stage because it depended on the specific acoustic environment of the Headley Grange staircase, which was not transportable. They performed it only a handful of times in the early stages of their 1975 American tour, and even those performances were acknowledged to be approximations rather than reproductions of what was on the record. The song lived, effectively, only on the album. It was a document of a specific moment in a specific room that could not be revisited. Headley Grange closed to outside visitors for 40 years after Led Zeppelin's sessions there. It became a private residence, and the stairwell where Bonham had played was simply part of a family home, unavailable to the musicians and engineers who wanted to stand in it and understand what it had done. When Chad Smith, the drummer of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, was finally permitted to record in the space in 2015, he was the first drummer to do so since Bonham. He kissed the floor of the hall when he finished. He said he would never forget it as long as he lived. What he recorded there was impressive by any normal standard. It was not When the Levee Breaks, because When the Levee Breaks required John Bonham, and John Bonham had been dead for 35 years. The question of why the sound has never been exactly recreated is not a mystery in the technical sense. The technical elements are known and documented. The two biodynamic M160 microphones, the Helios compressors, the Benson Echo unit, the Rolling Stones mobile truck, the specific processing decisions that Johns and Page made in the hours after the recording. All of this has been described in detail, studied by engineers, reproduced in controlled conditions with identical equipment. The results are always impressive. They are never the same. The reason is the one that Andy Johns identified and refused to qualify. You really do need Bonzo. The architecture of the Headley Grange staircase was a necessary condition for the sound of When the Levee Breaks. But it was not sufficient. What turned that architecture into something historic was the specific interaction between the stone and the man, between the room's capacity to amplify and Bonham's capacity to give it something worth amplifying. A different drummer in that staircase would have produced a different sound. A great drummer would have produced a great sound. Only Bonham produced that sound, because only Bonham hit the drums the way Bonham hit the drums, with that combination of force and precision and feel and timing that no technical description has ever fully captured. Jimmy Page, who spent his career thinking about the relationship between performance and environment, between the natural acoustics of a space and the electronic processing that could extend and shape what the space did naturally, understood this about the recording with a clarity that made him direct when he discussed it. The drums had to breathe, he said. What the staircase at Headley Grange gave John Bonham's drums was room to breathe in a way that no purpose-built studio had provided before, and that no studio has fully replicated since. The stone walls were built in the 1790s for people who had nothing, to house them in conditions designed to remind them of that fact at every moment. What they did, incidentally, 200 years later, was give the greatest drum sound in rock and roll somewhere to live. If this story surprised you, there's more where this came from. Every episode on this channel is a real, documented Led Zeppelin story that history buried. Subscribe and hit the bell. New episode every week.